When Margaret Ellis appeared at the emergency room in Asheville on a late afternoon in early fall, she was barely recognizable, gaunt, gray-skinned, eyes hollow, and walking as if she had just escaped from a place that didn't belong to this world. The 34-year-old woman had been missing for 3 years in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a wilderness area where everyone believed she was dead. But what truly chilled the medical staff and police wasn't her appearance. The most terrifying part was what Margaret began to say about the 3 years erased from her life, and about a place whose control still clung to her even after she had returned. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the morning of September 18, 2018, the small parking area along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where a trailhead leads deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, appeared in its familiar quiet state of the western North Carolina mountains as Margaret Ellis pulled in and closed the car door behind her. At 34 years old, Margaret had lived in Asheville for many years and considered day hikes a steady, regular part of her routine. Not an adventurous or challenging activity, but a consistent habit to balance work and mental well-being. According to information later provided by her family, that morning's hike was prepared by Margaret in the most minimal way. She carried just enough gear for a short outing, with no signs of preparing to stay overnight, and no intention of leaving the familiar, frequently trafficked trails. Before leaving Asheville, she had proactively informed her family of her day's plan, including the starting point on the Blue Ridge Parkway, the expected hiking distance, the time she planned to return to the parking area, and the time frame for getting back to the city before dark. A schedule judged reasonable and consistent with her many years of backcountry experience. People present in the area that morning recalled that Margaret appeared calm, unhurried, showing no signs of anxiety, and there was no unusual interaction with others in the parking lot or along the trail. From morning through near noon, the Blue Ridge Parkway area maintained its normal rhythm as an outdoor recreation spot, with scattered vehicles stopping and hikers coming and going on the various trails, with no incidents or noteworthy situations recorded. Around midday, Margaret was last seen at a roadside pull-off, a spot commonly used for short breaks before continuing the hike, and at that time everything still appeared normal, with no indication she was in trouble or had changed her planned itinerary. After this point in time, Margaret did not return to the parking area as scheduled, and no communication from her was ever recorded. As the afternoon passed with no sign of her return, the family began trying to reach her by phone and other usual channels, but all attempts received no response, no signal connection, and a prolonged silence that stretched well beyond the time frame considered acceptable for a day hike. At first, the delay could be explained by ordinary possibilities, such as extending the route or resting longer than planned, but as time continued into the evening with no confirmation of Margaret's location or safety, the family's concern quickly escalated. In the context of the vast mountainous terrain, the many intersecting trails, and the common loss of cell service in the Blue Ridge Mountains, complete loss of contact became especially alarming, particularly because it was completely out of character for the way Margaret had always maintained communication and stuck to her plans on previous trips. When darkness fell, and Margaret still had not returned to Asheville as expected, the family was forced to face the reality that this absence was no longer within the realm of normal delay, and at that point they officially contacted authorities to report Margaret Ellis missing, closing what had seemed like an ordinary day with the beginning of an unexplained disappearance in the Blue Ridge Mountains. After the family contacted authorities on the night of the same day, the information about Margaret Ellis failing to return as planned was received and processed according to the standard procedure for a missing adult within Buncombe County, and an official missing adult case file was established with all the necessary administrative data fields completed. The on-duty officer recorded the time Margaret was last seen, the starting location on the Blue Ridge Parkway, the expected return time, and the point at which the family lost contact, while also verifying her identity through her driver's license, vehicle registration, Asheville residency records, and the most recent identifying photograph. The family was asked to provide detailed information about Margaret's daily routine, including her work schedule, habits of traveling independently, frequency of outdoor activities, and the way she typically handled communication while in mountainous areas with poor signal. This information revealed that Margaret led an independent but stable lifestyle, maintained a clear schedule, and had no history of prolonged loss of contact, especially during the many previous solo day hikes she had completed. During intake, authorities also noted personal background factors. She was 34 years old, in good physical condition, had no medical history affecting cognition, was not taking any medications with side effects that could cause disorientation, and showed no recent signs of psychological stress or noticeable behavioral changes, according to family and coworkers. An initial risk assessment was conducted based on the compilation of this data, along with the objective circumstances of the case, with emphasis on the vast mountainous terrain of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the popularity of the trail Margaret had chosen, and the weather conditions on the day of her disappearance, which were confirmed to be stable with no hazardous warnings. The receiving officers noted that Margaret had departed with gear appropriate for a day hike, carried no equipment for overnight stays, left no signs of preparing to abandon her current life, and showed no unusual actions such as arranging long-term work absences, transferring assets, or altering social relationships. The family confirmed that Margaret was not experiencing financial difficulties, was not involved in any legal disputes, had no complicated family or personal relationship conflicts, and had no history of substance use or high-risk behavior. Questions regarding the possibility of her voluntarily leaving the area, including purchases of travel tickets, lodging reservations, unusual cash withdrawals, or contact with unfamiliar individuals, were raised and quickly cross-checked against available information, but no data indicated that Margaret had deliberately left Asheville or planned to travel far from the region. In the intake reports, there were no accounts of conflicts, arguments, or the presence of suspicious strangers in the parking area or along the Blue Ridge Parkway at the time Margaret was last seen, and all identified witnesses described her as appearing normal, not panicked, not rushed, and without any unusual interactions. Authorities also considered the possibility of a sudden medical event or minor accident that could have delayed her return, but no initial information from family or medical records suggested any pre-existing condition that could lead to such a situation. Based on the overall synthesis of personal background, lifestyle habits, geographic context, and environmental conditions, the case was classified as an initial investigation for a missing adult in a natural environment, with the objective of verifying Margaret's safety and current location, using the verified facts already obtained. This classification reflected a cautious assessment at the time of intake. Margaret's absence was determined to be out of character, compared to her personal habits, but there was as yet no specific evidence indicating the involvement of violence, coercion, or criminal factors. All information was fully recorded in the case management system to ensure consistency, cross-referencing, and ongoing tracking of the missing person file. Right after Margaret Ellis's missing adult case file was fully established and initial information confirmed, Buncombe County's search and rescue forces were deployed, focusing on the area around the Blue Ridge Parkway and the adjacent trail branches in the Blue Ridge Mountains where Margaret was last seen. The initial search operation mobilized multiple units, including local rescue teams, National Park Service rangers, volunteers familiar with the terrain, and specialized teams experienced in handling missing persons cases in mountainous wilderness environments. The area around the parking lot was swept first, and Margaret's personal vehicle was quickly located still parked intact exactly where she had left it that morning, with no signs of tampering or movement. Inside the vehicle, several personal items were found consistent with what the family described, including everyday belongings she had not taken on the hike, indicating that Margaret had not left the area by another vehicle and showed no signs of preparing for long-distance travel. Search teams expanded the scope along the trail originating from the roadside pull-off, using tracking dogs to follow scent, combined with visual sweeps of high-risk areas such as drop-offs, rock crevices, steep slopes and dense, infrequently traveled sections of forest. Throughout the first few days, No evidence was found suggesting Margaret had suffered a serious accident. No torn clothing, no blood, no backpack or items abandoned along the trail, and no indication she had left the established path in an unusual manner. Search team reports noted that the terrain in this area featured numerous small forks, thick forest canopy, and limited visibility, making the detection of any traces extremely difficult, even though the initial weather had been assessed as relatively stable. As time passed, the search area was extended to neighboring zones, including deeper forest sections and less used trails, but the results still yielded no specific clues about Margaret's location or condition. Weather conditions began to change in the following days, with scattered rain, thick morning fog, and high humidity that obscured ground tracks, hindered the effectiveness of tracking dogs, and forced search teams to adjust their pace and scope to maintain safety. The mountainous terrain, with its many slippery steep slopes, dense vegetation, and lack of clear reference points, made sustained large-scale searching increasingly challenging. After a certain period with no new findings, participating units began to narrow their operational focus, concentrating on higher probability areas based on analysis of Margaret's anticipated route and experience with similar cases. Nevertheless, no evidence emerged to confirm that she had suffered a fatal accident, nor were there any signs that a body or personal items had been concealed within the searched zones. The compiled reports from search and rescue forces concluded that all reasonably accessible areas around the starting point and popular routes had been checked to the fullest extent feasible under the prevailing conditions, yet the outcome remained the absence of any decisive traces. As the number of search days increased without progress, resources were reallocated according to protocol, and operational intensity was gradually reduced to align with the realistic assessment of the likelihood of finding new clues. The family was kept regularly informed of the situation, including the fact that Margaret's vehicle and personal belongings were recovered intact, but with no additional signs whatsoever, a reality that made the overall picture increasingly vague and difficult to interpret. Based on the combined results of the search, the terrain conditions, the weather, and the complete lack of evidence of accident or death, Margaret's case was reclassified per guidelines for prolonged missing persons investigations with no new leads, shifting to an inactive status with reduced regular activity, and placed into the cold case category. This reflected the reality that all initial search efforts in the Blue Ridge Mountains had failed to provide a clear answer about where Margaret Ellis had gone or what had happened to her in the time since contact was lost. On a late afternoon in early fall in Asheville, nearly 3 full years after Margaret Ellis vanished from the Blue Ridge Mountains area, a woman appeared at the emergency department of a local medical facility in a condition that immediately drew the attention of the entire on-duty staff and prompted them to adjust intake procedures. This woman entered the reception area with a slow, shuffling gait, her body so emaciated that the bone structure was clearly visible beneath her faded, oversized, and filthy clothing that appeared to have been worn continuously for an extended period without proper washing or changing. Her skin was dry and dull, marked by numerous old small scratches, her hair tangled, brittle, and showing signs of breakage and loss due to prolonged malnutrition. Medical staff noted a strong body odor and weak breath, clear indicators of severe physical exhaustion, accompanied by signs of dehydration and chronic fatigue. When invited to sit down for the initial assessment, she took several seconds to understand the request, responding slowly and requiring specific guidance for each movement, from placing her hands on the chair arms to maintaining balance while sitting. Simple questions about her name, age, or current residence received no complete answers. She replied only with fragmented phrases, sometimes repeating the question or giving unrelated responses, demonstrating clear disorientation in both space and time. Medical staff observed that her gaze frequently avoided direct eye contact, her facial expression was nearly blank, and her reactions to loud sounds or the sudden appearance of others were quite delayed, as though her nervous system had become accustomed to a prolonged state of low alertness. During vital signs assessment, the initial readings reflected chronic malnutrition, weak pulse, low blood pressure, and unstable body temperature, forcing the medical team to prioritize stabilizing her physical condition before proceeding with any further in-depth evaluation. When asked if she was in pain anywhere or needed specific assistance, her responses remained vague, unfocused, and provided no valuable information, making it nearly impossible to obtain a medical history in the usual manner. She carried no identification documents, no phone, no wallet, nor any personal items that could help establish her identity, and she was also unable to clearly explain how she had arrived at the medical facility. The woman's behavior led experienced nurses and doctors to conclude that this was not a case of someone newly homeless, nor did it resemble typical acute debilitation from common medical conditions. Instead, it bore the characteristics of a person who had spent a long time detached from basic medical care and social environments. While recording identifying features, several staff members noticed that the woman's facial features, though gaunt and hollowed, bore a vague resemblance to images stored in internal bulletins and databases related to long-term missing persons cases in the Asheville area. This recognition was not clear enough to draw any conclusions, but it was sufficient to prompt an extra level of caution in handling the woman's file. Medical staff began discreet internal discussions, agreeing that every detail about her appearance, behavior, and responses needed to be documented fully and accurately, because the fact that a woman had appeared right in Asheville, in a state of severe emaciation and unable to identify herself, was a combination of factors that could not be taken lightly. Throughout the intake process, she showed no resistance or panic, but she also did not actively request help, displaying a prolonged passive state, as though she had grown accustomed to following instructions rather than making decisions on her own. When medical staff attempted to reassure her with gentle voices and limited the number of people in direct contact, she appeared somewhat calmer, but she still could not provide complete or coherent personal information. These reactions led the medical team to suspect that the woman may have spent a long time in a strictly controlled environment, where independent decision-making or free communication was not encouraged. Before concluding the initial intake procedure, the doctors agreed that this case required close monitoring, not only because of her severely debilitated physical state, but also due to the abnormal psychological and cognitive manifestations. The timing of the woman's appearance, nearly 3 years after an unsolved disappearance in this very area, combined with her inability to confirm her identity or provide any reliable personal information, led the medical team to conclude that this was very likely not just an ordinary emergency case, but one that could be directly connected to a missing persons file previously stored in the system, requiring the entire intake process to be handled with the highest possible level of caution. On that basis, after the initial steps to stabilize her physical condition were completed, and the abnormalities in the woman's behavior, cognition and personal orientation were fully documented, the hospital activated the Interagency Coordination Protocol, sending an official notification to local law enforcement to initiate identity verification procedures under the framework applied to cases suspected of involving missing persons. Police received the information in the context of the woman having no identification documents on her, being unable to establish her identity, and exhibiting multiple preliminary matching characteristics with a missing persons file previously stored in the Buncombe County system. After arriving at the medical facility, law enforcement worked directly with medical staff to collect all recorded data, including descriptions of appearance, physical condition, behavior, level of awareness, and the time of the woman's appearance. Due to her still unstable health and clear signs of disorientation, police agreed not to conduct an interrogation and instead focused on non-invasive identity verification measures. The woman's fingerprints were taken according to standard procedure, under medical supervision to ensure no additional stress or impact on her condition, and this data was sent for comparison with current state and federal identification databases. While awaiting results, the assigned officers reviewed unresolved missing persons cases in the Asheville area and surrounding regions, focusing on adult disappearances in natural environments with timelines, matching the point nearly 3 years earlier. In parallel with the fingerprint comparison, police coordinated with the medical facility to match basic medical information, including blood type, treatment history, biological characteristics, and physical markers previously recorded in old medical records before the disappearance. This comparison was carried out carefully, as prolonged emaciation can significantly alter appearance and certain biological indicators, making visual identification unreliable. When the fingerprint comparison results were returned, the data showed a clear match with the file of Margaret Ellis, who had been reported missing nearly 3 years earlier from the Blue Ridge Parkway area. This result was cross-checked multiple times to rule out technical errors, while Margaret's prior medical information also showed compatibility with what was currently being recorded at the facility, further reinforcing the reliability of the identification. After completing all necessary verification steps, police officially confirmed that the woman who appeared at the emergency department was Margaret Ellis, and this information was formally documented in the Missing Persons Case Management System. Margaret's family was contacted immediately afterward, with the notification delivered cautiously, emphasizing that she had been positively identified and was receiving medical care, but that her current physical and psychological condition required a controlled approach. The family's reaction was recorded as one of both shock and caution, as Margaret being found after such a long disappearance exceeded all initial expectations, while the information about her condition indicated a serious degree of trauma. The first meeting between Margaret and her family was arranged at the medical facility under close supervision by the medical team and the discreet presence of law enforcement, to ensure no emotional overload for Margaret and no disruption to her health monitoring process. Before the meeting, the family was briefed on necessary communication boundaries, including avoiding rapid-fire questions, refraining from referencing timelines or events that could cause cognitive disruption, and focusing on creating a sense of safety for Margaret. The meeting took place in a quiet atmosphere, with complex emotional responses from both sides, as Margaret showed vague recognition of her loved ones, but did not display the full reactions she once had, consistent with the documented disorientation. Immediately after identity confirmation, Margaret's missing persons file was reactivated in the system at high priority, reflecting the fundamental shift in the case, from one with no leads to a live victim situation requiring protection, evaluation, and handling under stricter protocols. All new information was fully updated into the file, including the time of reappearance, initial health condition, and identity verification results, ensuring that every relevant piece of data was compiled consistently to support case management and coordination among involved agencies within the framework of the now reopened investigation. After Margaret Ellis's identity was confirmed and her vital signs had been stabilized to a minimum safe level, a comprehensive medical evaluation was conducted with the goal of clarifying the extent of accumulated physical trauma and determining the temporal nature of the biological changes that had occurred in her body. Initial clinical examination results revealed severe prolonged malnutrition, clearly evident through a body mass index significantly lower than her pre-disappearance medical records, widespread subcutaneous fat loss across the entire body, and signs of chronic micronutrient deficiencies, including iron, vitamin D, vitamin B12, and folate, key factors for neurological function, hematopoiesis, and energy metabolism. Blood tests showed persistently low levels of albumin and prealbumin, inconsistent with short-term starvation, while also reflecting long-term protein deficiency that had impacted tissue repair and immune function. Doctors noted diffuse muscle atrophy, particularly pronounced in weight-bearing muscle groups such as the quadriceps, gluteals, and lower back muscles, with markedly reduced muscle mass and strength, accompanied by early fatigue during basic movements. Motor function assessment revealed restricted range of motion in multiple major joints, with the hips and knees showing stiffness and pain on active movement, consistent with prolonged immobility or minimal activity rather than the aftermath of a single injury. Imaging studies detected no acute fractures or recent blunt force trauma near the time of admission, but did reveal microstructural changes in soft tissues and joint capsules, commonly seen in cases of extended restricted movement without rehabilitative intervention. Margaret's skin exhibited numerous abnormalities, including reduced elasticity, chronic dryness, and patchy areas of hyper and hypopigmentation, along with markedly heightened sensitivity to bright light, prompting doctors to consider physiological adaptation to a long-term environment lacking natural sunlight. Neurological examination recorded delayed pupillary reflexes, mild disruption of sleep-wake cycles, and impaired thermoregulation, signs often associated with prolonged disruption of the circadian rhythm. Endocrine testing revealed imbalances in hormones regulating biological rhythms, including cortisol and melatonin, with unstable fluctuation amplitudes, consistent with the body not receiving regular exposure to daytime light and nighttime darkness, according to natural physiological cycles. The medical team compared all current metrics with Margaret's pre-disappearance medical records, including routine checkups, physical fitness data, and prior lab results, and observed clear differences that could not be explained by a short-term accident or an acute period of debilitation. The recorded changes were systemic, simultaneously affecting muscles, bones, skin, endocrine function, and metabolism, indicating a continuous and cumulative process of injury. When estimating the time frame for the formation of these injuries, the doctors unanimously concluded that the degree of malnutrition, muscle atrophy, and biological disruption could not have developed in just a few weeks or short months, but required a prolonged continuous period, typically measured in many months to multiple years, under conditions of sustained nutritional deficit and restricted movement. This assessment was reinforced by the absence of typical signs associated with long-term outdoor survival, such as weather-related skin damage, respiratory conditions from prolonged exposure to cold, damp environments, or the calluses and foot injuries, characteristic of constant travel over natural terrain. Instead, Margaret's pattern of injury aligned more closely with living in a confined space with limited light, inadequate food portions, and controlled levels of physical activity. Doctors also noted that her body's adaptation to light deprivation and minimal movement indicated this was not a short-term experience, as such physiological changes require extended time to develop. All test results, examinations and imaging findings were systematically compiled and meticulously documented in the medical record to ensure accuracy and comparability. On the basis of the objective data collected, the professional conclusion was reached that Margaret Ellis's current health status was incompatible with a short-term accidental incident or a brief period of being lost in the wilderness, but instead reflected a very high likelihood that she had endured a prolonged period of severe restriction in nutrition, movement, and light exposure, consistent with the context of extended confinement under substandard living conditions, leaving profound cumulative consequences on her physical well-being. In parallel with the physical medical evaluation process, a team of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists was assigned to conduct an in-depth assessment of Margaret Ellis's psychological state under strictly controlled conditions, prioritizing her safety and avoiding emotional overload. From the very first contact sessions, the specialists noted a pronounced submissive reflex in Margaret's behavior, evident in her near-constant waiting for instructions before carrying out any action, from minor decisions such as where to sit or when to drink water, to responding to questions. When asked open-ended questions, Margaret often appeared confused, remained silent for extended periods, or sought eye contact with the interviewer, as if seeking permission, indicating a severely impaired ability to make independent decisions. The psychologists determined that this reflex was not a temporary situational response, but had become a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern, one that typically forms only after a prolonged period of living in a controlled environment, where making choices on one's own could lead to negative consequences. Margaret also displayed a clear pattern of avoidance, not only in eye contact, but also in the content of exchanges, tending to sidestep questions related to personal experiences, previous living spaces, or extended time periods, instead redirecting answers to unrelated details or repeating the question back to the asker. In executive function assessments, Margaret showed considerable difficulty with simple planning, risk evaluation, and choosing between safe options, even in low-pressure hypothetical scenarios. When required to make independent decisions, She frequently exhibited heightened anxiety, rapid breathing, muscle tension, and sometimes requested to stop, demonstrating that taking responsibility for her own choices had become a significant source of psychological stress. The specialists also documented a disturbance in her perception of personal safety. Margaret was unable to clearly distinguish between safe and dangerous situations in the current environment, at times perceiving ordinary spaces, such as hospital rooms or hallways, as highly risky, while showing indifference or lack of response to hypothetical warning signals. Her ability to adapt to open environments was markedly reduced, shown through strong anxiety reactions when exposed to wide spaces, bright lights, or mixed sounds, leading her to seek out corners, enclosed areas, and to request fewer people nearby. When placed in simple simulated social situations, Margaret quickly became overwhelmed, lost focus, became disoriented, and required extended time to calm down, manifestations commonly seen in individuals who have endured prolonged trauma in restricted environments. Trauma level assessment indicated that Margaret had not experienced a single shocking event, but rather a continuous series of experiences that steadily eroded her sense of safety, autonomy, and personal identity. Standardized tests revealed classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including unwanted fragmented memory intrusions, exaggerated startle responses to unexpected stimuli, avoidance of topics or sensations reminiscent of negative experiences, and a persistently heightened state of alertness, even in safe surroundings. However, Margaret's symptom pattern extended beyond the typical framework of PTSD, as she also exhibited disturbances in emotional regulation, prolonged feelings of emptiness, difficulty maintaining stable emotional connections, and a profound impairment in self-perception. The specialists concluded that Margaret had developed psychological adaptation mechanisms to survive in a long-term unsafe environment, in which submission, reduced emotional expression, and limited initiative became survival strategies. These mechanisms, while once helpful for adapting to her previous circumstances, had become major barriers to reintegration into the current environment. After synthesizing clinical observations, structured interview results, and standardized assessment outcomes, the expert team issued a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, reflecting that Margaret had endured prolonged repeated trauma within a context from which escape was not possible. This diagnosis accounts for the combination of classic trauma symptoms, with deeper disruptions in personality, cognition, and self-regulation capacity, while emphasizing that Margaret's psychological recovery will require a long period, a cautious approach, and continuous support to gradually restore her sense of safety, autonomy, and ability to make independent decisions in the present environment. After the independent medical conclusions and psychological evaluations, both pointed to a pattern of prolonged systematic trauma, incompatible with a short-term accident or self-survival in the wilderness. Law enforcement officially reclassified Margaret Ellis's case from a prolonged missing persons file to a serious criminal investigation with indicators of foul play. The decision to reclassify the case was made after fully compiling all verified objective data, with emphasis on evidence showing that Margaret had been forced to live under controlled conditions involving restricted movement, lack of light, and inadequate nutrition over an extended period, along with psychological manifestations characteristic of prolonged trauma due to loss of autonomy. This shift in direction required a comprehensive adjustment to the structure and objectives of the investigation. The focus was no longer on determining the whereabouts of a missing person, but on clarifying the acts of abduction and unlawful confinement that had occurred, as well as identifying related criminal responsibility. A dedicated investigative task force was established under the direction of the Buncombe County Criminal Investigations Unit, composed of investigators experienced in handling cases of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, prolonged abuse, and crimes involving long-term victim control. The task force structure was designed with clear division of responsibilities to ensure each area of work was handled in depth and to prevent information overlap. One group was assigned to thoroughly review the entire initial missing persons file on Margaret, from the time the report was received through the search process, up to when the file was classified as a cold case, with the goal of identifying details previously considered non-critical in a search and rescue context, but potentially carrying criminal significance when viewed through the new investigative framework. This group focused on reanalyzing timelines, witness statements from the parking area and along the Blue Ridge Parkway, as well as vehicle-related data, in order to uncover any gaps in the original chain of events. Another group was responsible for working directly with the medical and psychological teams, translating professional conclusions into investigative points usable in a criminal context, particularly the estimation of the confinement timeframe, characteristics of the living environment, and the degree of control the victim had endured. This group also ensured that all inferences were grounded in scientific data and could withstand legal standards. In parallel, a field investigation team was tasked with reconstructing the initial contact scenario between Margaret and the perpetrator, based on her anticipated route on the day of disappearance, terrain features, roadside pull-offs, and low-traffic areas within the Blue Ridge Mountains. This team concentrated on identifying high-probability locations where approach, restraint, and removal of the victim could have occurred without drawing attention, especially areas outside the scope of the original search efforts. A data and records analysis group was assigned to review crime reports, civil complaints, arrest records, and intelligence information in the Asheville area and surrounding regions during the period Margaret was missing, focusing on individuals with histories of violence, controlling behavior, or involvement in unlawful confinement and prolonged abuse cases. This group also examined geographic and social factors, including low-density rural areas, isolated properties, and spaces capable of concealing criminal activity over extended periods. Based on the initial data, the task force developed preliminary crime hypotheses, with the central hypothesis being that Margaret was approached and subdued shortly after leaving the roadside pull-off, then transported to a concealed confinement location, where living conditions were strictly controlled and contact with the outside world was prevented. These hypotheses were constructed in an open manner, without ruling out the possibility that the perpetrator acted alone, but with deep knowledge of the local terrain, and the ability to maintain concealment for a long time, or that there may have been indirect support from the surrounding environment. The determination of the new investigative scope was carried out systematically, expanding beyond the original search area, while remaining focused on regions with a high likelihood of concealing prolonged confinement, including sparsely populated rural zones, rarely inspected structures, and properties outside regular community oversight. Throughout the entire reorientation of the investigation, investigators adhered to the principle of minimizing direct contact with Margaret to avoid causing additional trauma, while using objective data as the foundation for all decisions. The reclassification of the case, the establishment of a dedicated investigative task force, the specific assignment of duties, and the formulation of initial crime hypotheses, marked a fundamental change in the approach to the case, reflecting the determination that Margaret Ellis's disappearance and reappearance were no longer to be regarded as an unexplained anomaly, but as the consequence of an organized criminal act that must be investigated according to strict criminal standards. After the investigative direction was re-established under a criminal framework and medical conditions permitted controlled contact, the initial collection of Margaret Ellis's statement was conducted according to a special protocol, with close coordination among investigators, psychological experts, and medical staff to ensure no additional trauma was caused, and no pressure was placed on the victim to recall details beyond her current capacity to endure. From the very first working sessions, investigators noted that Margaret's statement was fragmented, disjointed, and lacking a clear chronological structure, with memory fragments emerging out of sequence, sometimes interrupted by prolonged silences or confusion between different periods. Margaret had difficulty identifying specific time markers, could not accurately state how much time had passed between events, and often described her experiences only in general sensations, rather than a continuous sequence of actions. When asked about the initial moment of loss of freedom, she could not specify a day or hour, only mentioning that everything changed very quickly after leaving the trail area, and her memory of that moment was overshadowed by feelings of panic and loss of control. Investigators observed that whenever questions approached specific details, Margaret tended to become tense, her responses slowed, and at times she stopped answering altogether, indicating that her nervous system still reacted strongly to recollection. Although lacking clear timelines and event sequences, Margaret's statement showed remarkable consistency in describing the living conditions during the period of control, with repeatedly mentioned details about confined space, lack of natural light, minimal and monotonous food portions, and severely restricted movement within a narrow area. She described the gradual blurring of day and night, time losing any specific meaning, and compliance with instructions becoming an automatic reflex to avoid undefined consequences. These descriptions aligned with the previously recorded medical and psychological evaluations, reinforcing the overall reliability of the statement, despite individual details being incomplete. Margaret was unable to clearly identify the perpetrator, providing no name, specific identifying features, or number of individuals involved, and when asked about faces, voices, or personal characteristics, her answers were typically vague or uncertain. Psychological experts explained that the inability to identify the perpetrator is common among victims of prolonged trauma, especially when survival depended on avoiding attention to the source of threat and limiting memory of details that could trigger fear responses. Similarly, Margaret could not clearly identify the place of confinement, describing it only through sensory characteristics such as musty odor, enclosed space, cold hard surfaces, and limited sounds, without being able to link those experiences to a specific geographic location. When asked whether she had been moved between different locations, she appeared uncertain, sometimes feeling everything occurred in the same space, other times sensing changes, but unable to determine how. Investigators noted that this lack of specific information was not indicative of intentional avoidance, but was consistent with the diagnosed disorientation, memory disruption, and psychological defense mechanisms. Throughout the statement collection process, questions were designed to be open-ended, avoiding demands for precise detail confirmation, and focusing instead on recording the consistent elements that repeatedly appeared in Margaret's narrative. These elements included a constant sense of being controlled, severe restrictions on movement and communication, and a complete lack of autonomy in daily activities. Although she could not provide a complete picture of the event sequence or the perpetrator's identity, Margaret's statement was still assessed as having high directional value, as it offered an experiential framework consistent with the objective data already gathered. Investigators recorded that the consistency regarding confinement conditions, combined with the medical and psychological evidence, allowed the elimination of many incompatible scenarios and focused resources on hypotheses better aligned with a pattern of prolonged control. Margaret's entire initial statement was fully documented, unedited, and without inference, accompanied by professional notes on her psychological state at each point of response, to ensure the information was used cautiously and accurately. In the context of the victim not yet being able to provide a coherent narrative, the fragmented but consistent statement about the nature of Margaret's experience was regarded as an important data source for guiding the investigation, helping investigators establish the search scope, develop fitting hypotheses, and avoid imposing assumptions unsupported by the psychological reality of someone who has endured prolonged trauma. After Margaret Ellis's initial statement was recorded and determined to have high directional value despite lacking specific details, the investigative agency proceeded with the forensic examination of the body and environment to search for independent physical evidence that could support or supplement what the victim was not yet able to express verbally. This process was carried out in coordination among forensic experts, biologists, and environmental specialists, beginning with a comprehensive analysis of biological traces remaining on Margaret's body. Hair samples, fingernails, dead skin and fabric fibers adhering to her clothing were carefully collected to check for the presence of microscopic particles, organic and inorganic substances that could reflect the living environment prior to her appearance at the medical facility. Hair analysis revealed an accumulation of characteristic minerals and compounds inconsistent with the urban environment of Asheville, suggesting that Margaret had prolonged exposure to a geologically distinct space. Under the fingernails, and in skin creases, experts detected fine soil particles and microscopic plant fibers that did not correspond to the mountainous areas frequently checked during the initial search phase. In parallel, pollen samples collected from Margaret's hair and clothing showed the presence of numerous plant species uncommon along the main tourist trails of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but more typical of secondary forest areas with minimal human impact and thick canopy cover. Comparison of these pollen samples with the regional environmental database allowed experts to determine that Margaret had been in an ecosystem different from the site of her initial disappearance, and likely outside the traditional search radius of previous rescue operations. Soil analysis from her shoes and clothing recorded the presence of mineral components characteristic of high-moisture sandy clay soils, commonly found in low-lying areas or near old construction sites, rather than the dry granite slopes typical of many sections of the Blue Ridge Parkway. In addition to environmental traces, body forensics also documented signs consistent with prolonged forced labor, including unusual calluses on the palms and heels that were disproportionate to the limited mobility noted in the general medical evaluation. These calluses had shapes and distributions suggesting repeated simple but sustained movements, commonly associated with manual labor activities that require minimal travel, such as lifting, pulling, or manipulating objects in confined spaces. Several small healed scars were noted on the forearms and back, lacking characteristics of natural accidents, and more consistent with frequent contact with rough surfaces or tools under inadequate protective conditions. These data were cross-referenced with Margaret's fragmented statement about having to perform repetitive actions in a confined space, even though she could not clearly describe their purpose or context. The environmental forensics team compared all collected data with geographic and ecological maps of the Asheville area and surrounding regions, thereby eliminating certain geographic zones that showed no match in soil composition, vegetation, or environmental conditions. Areas with hard rock terrain, dry soil, or vegetation typical of primary forests were removed from priority consideration, as they did not align with the analyzed pollen and soil samples. This comparison process enabled the narrowing of the investigative scope to areas with more matching environmental characteristics, including sparsely populated rural zones, locations with old or abandoned structures, and places with damp soil, low light, and vegetation typical of minimally disturbed environments. The forensic conclusions were recorded independently of the victim's statement to avoid circular reasoning, and were treated as an objective data layer to help reshape the overall picture of the case. Although they did not provide a specific location, the biological and environmental traces allowed the elimination of many initial hypotheses, while reinforcing the determination that Margaret was not held in the traditional search area, and had spent an extended period in an environment with distinct geographic, ecological, and man-made features. Narrowing the investigative scope, based on body and environmental forensics, created a solid foundation for concentrating resources on areas and scenarios more consistent with the physical evidence, ensuring that the investigative direction continued to be guided by objective data rather than speculation. Based on the established body and environmental forensic results, the investigative agency proceeded to synthesize the data along geographic lines, transforming the microscopic traces into specific spatial boundaries that could be delineated on a map. All pollen samples, soil components, trace minerals, and biological indicators collected from Margaret Ellis's body and clothing were entered into a comparison system against the ecological database for Western North Carolina, including layers of information on soil types, soil moisture, characteristic vegetation, forest canopy density, and elevation-based distribution. Environmental specialists worked in coordination with investigators to cross-reference each data group against detailed ecological maps, progressively eliminating areas lacking the necessary matches. Regions with dry granite bedrock, vegetation typical of high-elevation pine forests on steep slopes, and rapid drainage were excluded, as they did not align with the moist sandy clay soil samples and the recorded pollen species. Similarly, areas near the main tourist routes of the Blue Ridge Parkway, and locations with high human intervention, failed to match the environmental profile reflected in the biological traces due to markedly different pollen diversity compared to what was found. This elimination process shifted the search radius away from the zones initially prioritized by search and rescue teams in the early phase, reinforcing the conclusion that the confinement location was not within the original search area and likely belonged to a distinct ecosystem, while still remaining within a reachable radius from Asheville. When the data was systematically layered, one area gradually emerged with a high degree of compatibility in soil composition, vegetation, and environmental conditions. Pisgah National Forest, a vast forested region with complex terrain, many sparsely populated sections, and a history of old structures and infrequently used logging roads. The specialists noted that the ecosystem of Pisgah National Forest commonly features the plant species matching the collected pollen samples, along with long-standing moist soil areas and low light due to dense canopy cover, consistent with the physiological adaptation signs observed in Margaret. This delineation was not based on a single indicator, but resulted from the convergence of multiple independent data layers, from biological forensics to environmental analysis, creating a highly consistent geographic picture. After the primary focus area was identified, investigators reviewed information related to unauthorized residency activities within Pisgah National Forest and adjacent regions, including reports of unregistered cabins, temporary camps, abandoned structures, and locations previously documented as occupied outside official land management systems. Data from rangers, land management agencies, and community reports were compiled to identify sites capable of providing concealed spaces with minimal oversight and the potential to sustain long-term habitation without drawing attention. Particularly, areas far from main roads, accessible only via secondary trails or old logging roads, were assessed as high risk, as they met the requirements for concealment and control of a confinement space. The review process also included cross-referencing historical civil complaints, noise reports, unusual activity sightings, and forest trespass incidents over multiple prior years, in order to uncover locations that had appeared in scattered records, but had never been connected. From this synthesis, a list of suspect locations was compiled, with each site evaluated according to specific criteria such as environmental compatibility, discrete accessibility, usage history, and level of official oversight. This list was not intended to immediately pinpoint a single location, but served as a priority map, enabling investigators to concentrate resources on the areas with the highest probability based on objective data. Geographic delineation in this manner reflected a shift from assumption-based investigation to one grounded in specific environmental evidence, where every narrowing decision was supported by independent forensic data. By the time the delineation was completed, the geographic picture of the case had changed significantly from the initial assessment, with Pisgah National Forest emerging as the central focus area, and the list of unauthorized residency sites becoming the foundation for deploying targeted investigative steps within the defined scope. Based on the list of suspect locations established within Pisgah National Forest and the surrounding areas, the investigative task force shifted its focus to screening individuals who lived in isolation, capable of maintaining a residence outside the usual oversight systems, and consistent with the environmental profile confirmed by forensics. This screening was not limited to those with clear criminal records, but extended to individuals with a history of detached living, minimal social interaction, freelance or unstable employment, and the ability to control a confined space over a long period without attracting attention. Data was collected from multiple sources, including land management records, ranger reports, scattered civil complaints over many years, as well as information provided by the local community about people living reclusively in the forest or near the boundaries of the national forest. Through a multi-layered screening process, one individual emerged with a high degree of match to the investigative criteria, identified as Matthew, who had a history of unstable but prolonged residency in the southern portion of Pisgah National Forest. Records showed that Matthew had alternately lived in unregistered cabins and makeshift structures deep in the forest, accessible via old, seldom-used logging roads that fell outside regular patrol routes. Examination of his residency history revealed that Matthew had no fixed address for an extended period, relied on self-sufficient living methods, limited contact with the community, and frequently changed locations while remaining within the same ecological zone, consistent with the environmental data collected from Margaret's body. Investigators noted that Matthew possessed deep knowledge of the local terrain, having worked seasonal jobs related to logging and forest road maintenance, which gave him familiarity with secondary paths, hidden areas, and locations with minimal oversight. When analyzing the approach to the victim, the task force focused on the possibility that Matthew could have appeared at roadside pull-offs along the Blue Ridge Parkway without drawing attention, under the guise of someone familiar with the area, and with an unremarkable appearance. Behavioral hypotheses suggested that Matthew may have approached Margaret in a manner that did not immediately create a sense of threat, exploiting the victim's familiarity with the natural environment and her inherent trust toward individuals who appeared knowledgeable about the terrain. Behavioral psychological analysis of Matthew, based on indirect statements from those who had interacted with him and collected data, revealed a high tendency toward control, possessiveness, and a desire to maintain absolute power in unbalanced relationships. The motive was determined not to be financial or impulsive, but rather centered on a long-term need for control, where the confinement and deprivation of the victim's autonomy became the core of the criminal behavior. Behavioral analysis experts assessed that this type of motive is often accompanied by the selection of highly independent victims, as the contrast between the victim's strong identity and the state of absolute control can reinforce the perpetrator's sense of power. When cross-referenced with the psychological conclusions about Margaret, the compatibility became evident, particularly in her submissive reflexes, loss of independent decision-making ability, and disturbed perception of personal safety, characteristics that commonly emerge after prolonged control by a single individual. A risk assessment for reoffending was conducted based on multiple factors, including Matthew's history of isolated living, his ability to access new potential victims in similar environments, and the absence of clear social barriers to his behavior. Investigators concluded that, without intervention, this pattern of controlling and possessive behavior carried a risk of continuation, as it was not dependent on temporary circumstances, but tied to the suspect's personality structure and lifestyle. On the basis of the compiled data regarding residency, living patterns, approach behavior, and psychological motive, Matthew was identified as the primary suspect in the case, as the individual's personal profile showed a high degree of alignment with the crime pattern constructed from forensic, medical, and psychological evidence. The identification of the suspect did not stem from a single isolated indicator, but resulted from the convergence of multiple independent data layers, allowing the task force to shift focus from narrowing the spatial scope to conducting field verification of the hypotheses already formed, while simultaneously raising the need for a specific assessment of the suspect's level of dangerousness in the context of behavior showing signs of prolonged duration and organization. Based on that, the investigators proceeded with a direct approach to a suspect location deep within Pisgah National Forest, a site flagged as an unauthorized residence, with a high degree of compatibility with the long-term confinement conditions inferred from the entire body of evidence. The approach was executed according to a safety plan due to the complex terrain, narrow access paths heavily obscured by dense vegetation, and the only feasible entry being via an old, seldom-used logging road featuring numerous eroded sections with no signs of regular maintenance. As they neared the area, investigators noted the absence of community activity indicators, no newly formed trails, no scattered trash, and no frequent signs of multiple people's comings and goings, consistent with the assumption that this was an isolated living space controlled by a single individual. The structure at the location was identified as a small building constructed from wood, scrap metal, and reused materials, with evidence of incremental reinforcement over time through hand-fastened joints, indicating long-term existence and use rather than a temporary shelter. The interior layout reflected a fully enclosed living space with limited square footage, low ceilings, and small windows blocked by multiple layers of material, significantly reducing the amount of natural light entering and creating a prolonged low-light environment. A rudimentary artificial lighting system was documented, powered by an independent source, sufficient for basic survival, but not for comfortable living conditions, suggesting a purpose of control, rather than ordinary habitation. Investigators recorded numerous deliberate movement restriction features, including an entry door with an external locking mechanism, removable metal bars, and fixed anchor points on the walls and floor that served no conventional residential purpose. On the floor, repeated wear patterns concentrated in a narrow area, along with small indentations and scuff marks, indicated the prolonged presence of a single person with severely restricted movement range. Consistent with the medical evaluation of muscle atrophy and joint stiffness due to extended immobility in Margaret. During the examination, numerous physical items of evidence were collected, including fabric fibers, hair, biological traces on frequently contacted surfaces, and simple household items, whose size and degree of wear matched those of an adult living under controlled conditions. Several items showed monotonous and repetitive use, with no signs of variation or personal choice, reflecting a complete lack of autonomy in daily activities. Functional areas such as the sleeping space, rudimentary waste disposal zone, and food storage all exhibited signs of long-term accumulation, with minimal organization, but sufficient to sustain existence over an extended period, reinforcing the conclusion of prolonged habitation at this site. Soil samples, pollen, and microscopic materials were collected from multiple points inside the structure and the surrounding area, then compared with those previously found on Margaret's body and clothing, showing a high degree of similarity in environmental composition, particularly the characteristic pollen species and moist sandy soil structure. When cross-referenced with Margaret's fragmented statement, the spatial layout, lighting conditions, humidity, odor, and overall sensory feel of the location matched significantly with the sensory elements she had described, including the enclosed space, persistent musty smell, cold hard surfaces, and limited external sound penetration. These details, though not described by the victim in specific geographic terms, aligned most consistently with the reality at the site, demonstrating a direct connection between Margaret's experience and this location. Investigators also noted the spatial arrangement, designed to maximize control over anyone inside, with complete obstruction of external visibility into the structure, while those inside had almost no ability to observe the surrounding environment, consistent with the control and possessiveness pattern identified in the behavioral analysis of the suspect. The entire evidence collection process was conducted according to strict forensic protocols, with sealing, detailed documentation, and photography of each item to ensure integrity and future comparability. On the basis of the combined indicators of long-term habitation, the physical evidence collected, the clear environmental similarities, and the high degree of fit with the victim's statement, the task force confirmed that this location was not merely an unauthorized residence, but fully met the criteria of a long-term confinement site, directly reflecting the enclosed living conditions and level of control that Margaret Ellis had endured, thereby shifting previous hypotheses from indirect analysis to conclusions substantiated by specific on-site verification. From this established on-site foundation, the investigation continued to expand into an analysis of the modus operandi, by synthesizing data on behavior, environment, and control traces to reconstruct a consistent sequence of actions, clarifying how the subject approached, isolated, and maintained control over Margaret over a prolonged period, without the need for direct physical violence. Analysis of the initial approach showed that the subject selected a timing and context with clear psychological advantage, when the victim was alone in a familiar natural space where brief social interactions are typically viewed as normal and non-threatening. The subject was assessed to have appeared with a neutral image, leveraging knowledge of the terrain to assume the role of a guide, information provider, or situational helper, thereby lowering the victim's guard and establishing contact without triggering defensive responses. The approach carried no immediate signs of coercion, but relied on subtle behavioral adjustments, causing the victim to voluntarily move in the direction set by the subject without fully perceiving the risk. Once the approach was complete, Isolation was implemented swiftly, shifting the victim from an open environment to a confined space in a short time, minimizing the victim's opportunity to reassess the situation or seek assistance. Isolation here was not merely spatial separation, but also the severance of perceptual anchors, including time, light, and the presence of others, creating disorientation from the outset. The analysis showed that the subject prioritized methods that produced little noise, left minimal traces, and attracted no attention, consistent with sustaining activity in a forested environment where any unusual sign could be detected. After isolation, control of information and communication was identified as the main pillar of the modus operandi, with drastic restriction of access to natural light, external information, and clear time markers, causing the victim to gradually lose the ability to situate herself in reality. The absence of information was not replaced with absolute silence, but with selective fragmented messages, enough to maintain dependency, but insufficient to restore a sense of safety or autonomy. Communication control also included shaping the content of interactions, where all exchanges revolved around basic survival needs, gradually narrowing the victim's scope of thought and expectations. Maintaining dependency without violence was assessed as a standout feature of the modus operandi, achieved through control of essential resources, such as food, water, light, movement, and permission to access space, creating a system of rewards and deprivations that taught the victim to comply in order to reduce instability. Rather than using violence that would cause obvious injury, the subject relied on cumulative debilitation, prolonged fatigue, and isolation to weaken resistance, a strategy that was both effective and reduced the risk of leaving easily identifiable forensic traces. The analysis showed that the victim's daily decisions were not permitted to form independently, but were always tied to the subject's implicit or explicit approval, reinforcing feelings of helplessness and dependence. Psychological control was sustained by blurring the boundary between safety and danger, where the victim could not predict the consequences of her actions, leading to compliance as a self-protection mechanism. Evaluation of the repetitive nature of the behavior, based on the spatial structure and organization of daily life, showed that this modus operandi was not random but highly standardized, with control elements designed to operate reliably over time. The arrangement of lighting, door locks, living areas, and monotonous daily rhythms reflected deliberate preparation and the ability to fine-tune behavior to optimize control effectiveness. The signs of minimal yet stable organization indicated that the subject had built a model capable of long-term sustainability, with low risk, consistent with prolonged confinement in an isolated environment. Behavioral analysis also indicated that the choice of a highly independent victim familiar with the natural environment was not random, as it facilitated smooth initial contact while amplifying the psychological impact when autonomy was completely stripped away. The completion of the modus operandi profile was accomplished by systematizing the identified components, including non-suspicious approach, rapid isolation, control of information and communication, maintenance of dependency through essential resources, avoidance of overt violence, and standardization of the confinement space, forming a consistent chain of behavior that fully explains the accumulated physical and psychological injuries documented. The modus operandi profile shows that the criminal behavior was not based on immediate physical strength, but was built on the foundation of environmental control and psychological manipulation, reflecting a high degree of intent, systematic nature, and the capacity for prolonged maintenance without detection over a significant period of time. Based on this clear identification of the nature of the case, the investigators continued to delve deeply into reconstructing the specific confinement process by combining on-site analysis, repeated activity traces, and the accumulated physical, psychological injuries documented in Margaret Ellis, thereby clarifying that this was not random captivity, but an intentionally established, stably operating, and long-maintained system of control. The imposition of a forced daily schedule was identified as the core foundation of the entire process, in which the victim's rhythm of life was completely severed from the natural day-night cycle. The absence of sunlight, combined with weak and inconsistent artificial lighting, caused traditional time markers such as morning, noon, and evening to gradually lose meaning, forcing the victim to rely entirely on signals provided by the controlling subject to determine when eating, resting, or moving was permitted. These repetitive activities in a fixed sequence not only eroded the ability to orient time, but also caused the victim to progressively lose any sense of initiative, as every decision was replaced by waiting for permission. Control over eating and daily routines was implemented with meticulous calculation, in which food portions were maintained at the bare minimum, sufficient to sustain life, but insufficient to restore physical strength or provide lasting satiety, leading to chronic hunger and prolonged debilitation. Food varied little in type or form, creating monotony and dependency, as the victim had no ability to choose or adjust according to personal needs. The provision of food on a fixed but sometimes inconsistent schedule kept the victim in a constant state of anticipation and anxiety, thereby reinforcing compliance as a survival reflex. Personal activities were severely restricted within a narrow space, with hygiene, rest, and movement permitted only in short, inflexible timeframes, causing the body to gradually adapt to low activity levels and develop the muscle, joint, and overall physical decline documented in the medical evaluation. Social contact was maintained at an absolute minimum, with all interaction cut off, except with the controlling subject, leaving the victim with no opportunity whatsoever to confirm reality, share emotions, or maintain an independent social identity. This prolonged social isolation severely undermined the ability to self-assess situations and reinforced the perception that the world existed only within the confines of the confinement space. The mechanism for maintaining confinement order did not rely on frequent physical violence, but on a combination of environmental control and behavioral conditioning, in which rules were enforced through repetition and the unpredictability of consequences. The subject did not need to constantly threaten or use force, because the very ambiguity of outcomes created a prolonged state of vigilance, leading the victim to choose compliance as the safest option. Physical elements such as door locks, bars, and enclosed spatial design served as supports, but order was primarily maintained through psychological control, where the victim gradually learned to self-regulate behavior to avoid unfavorable changes in living conditions. Monitoring of the victim's behavior was conducted indirectly through signs of activity and responses, including eating levels, movement, emotional expressions, and compliance with instructions, allowing the subject to assess psychological state and adjust the degree of control as needed. Small behavioral changes, even if not immediately addressed, were still accumulated as data to sustain long-term dominance. Evidence showed that the victim gradually internalized the confinement rules, self-restricting behavior even without direct supervision, reflecting that control had crossed the physical boundary to become internalized control. Evaluation of the level of control based on the synthesis of these factors showed that the confinement process achieved near total comprehensiveness, systematically stripping the victim of autonomy over time, space, eating, daily routines, and communication. The physical injuries such as debilitation, muscle atrophy, reduced bone density, and the psychological manifestations such as loss of independent decision-making ability, submissive reflexes, and distorted perception of safety were not random consequences, but the direct result of a stably maintained and prolonged process. This process demonstrated a shift from control through coercion to control through dependency, where the victim gradually accepted the imposed order as an unchangeable reality and adjusted behavior to survive within that framework. The entire confinement structure revealed a high degree of intent and meticulous calculation in every aspect of daily life, affirming that the effectiveness of the criminal behavior lay not in immediate violence, but in the long-term ability to dominate the victim's rhythm of life, resources, and perception, until the state of dependency became the default, and all capacity for resistance was gradually eroded. From this foundation of control, the investigators determined that psychological abuse and control were not ancillary elements, but a deeper operational layer of the confinement process, functioning in parallel with physical and daily life control, to restructure Margaret Ellis's perception, emotions, and identity toward prolonged dependency. Systematic mental punishment was documented not in the form of direct physical violence, but through mechanisms designed to produce sustained psychological stress, in which deliberate inconsistency in responses played a central role. Minimal rewards, interspersed with ambiguous deprivation, created a state of perpetual vigilance, making it impossible for the victim to predict the consequences of her behavior and forcing her to self-adjust in an excessively cautious direction. Forms of mental punishment included prolonged silence, delays in providing essential needs, sudden changes to the daily schedule, and denial of emotions, all aimed at undermining the sense of safety and confidence in personal judgment. The blurring of the concept of time was carried out systematically by completely severing natural markers, such as sunlight, environmental sounds, and stable routines, causing day and night to merge together. The absence of clocks, calendars, and time-marking events made memories fragmented and difficult to sequence, leading to the prolonged temporal disorientation documented in the psychological evaluation. When time no longer served as a reliable structure, the victim lost a crucial pillar for maintaining identity and planning, thereby increasing dependence on signals provided by the controlling subject. The dismantling of personal identity was achieved by progressively narrowing the scope of choices and expressions, where every decision, no matter how small, was controlled or conditioned. The continuous denial of the victim's needs, emotions, and memories, combined with suggestive messages about helplessness and vague threats, weakened the sense of an independent self. Manifestations showed that the victim gradually stopped asserting personal desires, instead focusing on avoiding conflict and maintaining a minimum state of stability, reflecting the erosion of personal identity over time. The reinforcement of psychological dependency was accomplished by turning the controlling subject into the sole source of information, needs, and validation, creating an asymmetrical relationship in which the victim was simultaneously fearful and dependent. This dependency did not form instantly, but was built gradually, as repeated negative experiences taught the victim to rely on the smallest signals to adjust behavior, thereby strengthening the dependency loop. Psychological control was maintained by blurring the boundary between punishment and safety, leaving the victim unable to distinguish real threats from normal states, resulting in the acceptance of control as an inevitable part of existence. Evaluation of long-term trauma showed that the psychological consequences were not limited to the period of confinement, but continued afterward, with manifestations such as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty making decisions, reduced ability to establish personal boundaries, and avoidance reflexes in open environments. These injuries reflected deep interference in cognitive and emotional structures, going beyond acute trauma to become enduring patterns of response. Cross-matching with medical records showed clear consistency between the psychological signs and biological indicators, including prolonged sleep disturbances, changes in stress-related hormone levels, and signs of neurological debilitation, all consistent with long-term psychological control. Doctors noted that the combination of malnutrition, lack of movement, and chronic psychological stress created a biological foundation conducive to sustaining psychological disorders, making the recovery process complex and prolonged. The alignment of medical data with the psychological abuse model showed that the injuries were not discrete consequences, but the result of a systematic control strategy, where each element, from blurring time, dismantling personal identity, to reinforcing dependency, contributed to a comprehensively dominated psychological state. The entire analysis demonstrated that psychological abuse was not merely a supporting tool, but the central pillar of maintaining confinement, enabling the controlling subject to achieve long-term power, without frequent physical violence, while also explaining the depth and persistence of the injuries documented in the victim's medical records. The arrest of suspect Matthew was carried out after the investigative agency and prosecution established full legal grounds based on the convergence of physical evidence, forensic conclusions, medical evaluations, and behavioral analysis, showing that the criminal behavior was systematic, prolonged, and posed an ongoing risk, if not promptly stopped. The arrest plan was developed in detail to ensure the safety of participating personnel, minimize risk to the community, and preserve the integrity of the previously identified evidence system. The arrest warrant was executed at a carefully selected time, when the suspect had no opportunity to access areas that could pose danger or interfere with evidence, and law enforcement forces could fully control the access space. Upon direct contact, officers noted that the suspect displayed a calm demeanor, superficial cooperation, but exhibited high emotional control, consistent with the behavioral profile analyzed during the investigation. The suspect was restrained according to standard procedure, fully informed of his legal rights, and removed from the area without incident. In parallel with the arrest, evidence collection and sealing operations were carried out simultaneously at relevant locations, with priority given to the confirmed confinement space and auxiliary areas used to sustain prolonged habitation. All collected physical evidence included locking mechanisms, bars, household items, biological traces on frequently contacted surfaces, fabric fibers, hair, as well as soil and pollen samples, all sealed under strict chain of custody protocols to ensure comparability in court. Items reflecting the organization of daily life and resource control were also seized to prove the intentional nature and extended duration of the confinement behavior. The evidence file was meticulously documented, accompanied by photographs, diagrams, and on-site descriptions to accurately recreate the confinement conditions and the level of control the victim had endured. On the basis of the formalized evidence, the prosecution proceeded with charges related to the offenses, focusing on kidnapping, prolonged unlawful imprisonment, deprivation of personal liberty, causing serious harm to physical and mental health, along with aggravating circumstances arising from the duration of the crime, the degree of control, and the long-term consequences for the victim. The charging decision reflected the assessment that the suspect's behavior was not impulsive or temporary, but a sustained organized series of actions with a clear purpose of control and possession. Preparation of the prosecution file emphasized building a tight connection between the victim's statement, though fragmented and partial due to trauma, and the system of physical evidence and independent expert conclusions. Medical reports documenting prolonged malnutrition, musculoskeletal injuries, and biological indicators inconsistent with short-term accident were entered as key scientific evidence. Psychological evaluations confirming complex post-traumatic stress disorder, submissive reflexes, and loss of independent decision-making ability were used to explain the harm mechanism and its direct link to prolonged control behavior. Environmental forensic analysis served as a bridge between the victim's statement and the crime scene, proving the similarity between biological traces on the victim's body and conditions at the confinement space. The prosecution file also included analysis of the modus operandi and confinement process to clarify the elements of intent, preparation, and potential for repetition, helping structure the charges to meet the strict evidentiary threshold of criminal proceedings. Assessment of the severity of the behavior was conducted across multiple dimensions, not only considering the prolonged duration of confinement, but also the comprehensive deprivation of autonomy, absolute social isolation, and long-lasting injuries affecting the victim's recovery capacity. Participating experts emphasized that the combination of malnutrition, lack of movement, chronic psychological stress, and blurring of personal safety perception created an accumulative harm model, making the consequences far exceed those typically seen in short-term confinement cases. The prosecution considered aggravating factors such as the selection of a victim in a vulnerable context, the preparation of an isolated confinement space, and the sophisticated level of control that did not require overt violence, thereby strengthening the argument regarding the degree of danger to the community. Based on a comprehensive risk assessment, the suspect was remanded in custody, pending trial by court order, to prevent any possibility of evidence tampering, witness influence, or reoffending. This decision was made after weighing the suspect's history of isolated living, ability to access concealed spaces, and the established pattern of controlling behavior, which indicated a high risk if released on bail. Pretrial detention conditions were applied in full compliance with legal regulations, ensuring the suspect's basic legal rights, while still meeting the requirements for community safety protection. The completion of the arrest and prosecution marked a clear shift in the case, from investigation to structured criminal accountability, where every procedural decision was built on a foundation of rigorous scientific and legal evidence. The entire arrest and prosecution process reflected a balanced effort to protect the victim's rights, ensure community safety, and strictly adhere to procedural principles, ensuring that all charges brought before the court are grounded in lawful, consistent, and highly persuasive evidence. On the basis of the completed prosecution file and full verification of its legality, as well as evidentiary structure, the case officially proceeded to trial under strictly heightened security measures, reflecting the severity of the conduct and the widespread public interest in the proceedings. The focus of the trial was the presentation, cross-examination, and rigorous scrutiny of the medical and forensic evidence system to establish a direct causal relationship between Matthew's prolonged confinement and control behavior, and the profound, destructive injuries that Margaret Ellis had to endure. Specialist physicians sequentially presented detailed medical conclusions before the court, describing chronic malnutrition with persistently low body mass index, diffuse muscle atrophy, joint and ligament damage due to long-term restricted movement, metabolic disorders, and signs of endocrine dysfunction directly linked to chronic stress. These conclusions were reinforced by biochemical test records, diagnostic imaging, and independent medical follow-up data, demonstrating that the injuries were cumulative in nature, formed over multiple years under strictly controlled living conditions, and could not be consistent with any scenario of a single accident, voluntary disappearance, or short-term survival environment. In parallel with the medical evidence, environmental forensic experts presented the results of biological trace analysis, pollen, soil composition, and microorganisms, proving a clear similarity between samples collected from the victim's body and clothing and those at the examined confinement location, thereby establishing an objective connection between the victim and the controlled space over an extended period. When the court compared these results with Margaret Ellis's statement, provided slowly, in fragments, and without chronological sequence, due to the severe psychological trauma, the court recognized the core consistency regarding central elements, such as restricted living conditions, enclosed space lacking light, absolute social isolation, control over daily rhythms, and prolonged dependency. Summoned psychological experts explained that the fragmented nature of the memories, difficulty in sequencing events, and avoidance when recalling experiences are typical manifestations of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which do not diminish the evidentiary value, but instead reflect the depth and duration of interference in the victim's cognitive structure. The trial court devoted the majority of its time to assessing Matthew's criminal responsibility, based on the synthesis of all evidence, carefully examining the elements of intent, degree of preparation, sophisticated methods of control, prolonged duration of the offense, and long-term consequences for the victim's physical and mental health. Defense arguments claiming the absence of frequent physical violence, or suggesting that the victim could have left at any time, were rebutted by proof that psychological control, absolute social isolation, blurring of personal safety perception, and survival dependency constituted deprivation of bodily liberty at a particularly serious level, independent of whether overt violence was used. The court emphasized that personal liberty is not only violated through beating or physical restraint, but is also deprived when a person is placed in a state of being unable to make decisions, access information, maintain personal identity, and having their entire rhythm of life comprehensively controlled over a long period. When considering aggravating circumstances, the trial court noted the multi-year duration of confinement, the severity and difficulty of recovery of the victim's injuries, the intentional preparation of the isolated confinement space, the sophisticated control methods that did not require overt violence, and the risk of reoffending if a severe penalty was not imposed. These factors were evaluated in the context of criminal conduct that was not impulsive, but a systematically sustained process, with calculation aimed at maximizing control and concealment over an extended time. On the basis of that entire analysis, the court sentenced Matthew to 38 years of imprisonment, with no possibility of early parole, reflecting the view that this was a particularly serious violation of personal liberty, human dignity, and mental safety. The judgment was issued not only to punish the individual offender, but also to send a clear legal message that sophisticated forms of confinement and control, even without leaving immediate traces of violence, are still regarded as serious crimes when they cause profound and lasting harm. The trial court stressed that the absence of overt violence does not diminish the dangerousness of the conduct, because the cumulative physical and psychological consequences can destroy a victim's autonomy and life for many years afterward. The conclusion of the legal process was recorded with the judgment taking effect, closing a lengthy series of proceedings involving multiple specialized fields, from criminal investigation, forensics medicine, to psychology, all contributing to clarifying the nature of the criminal behavior. The final judgment clearly established Matthew's criminal responsibility, not only providing a solid legal basis for sentence execution, but also affirming the principle that the law protects individuals even against the most sophisticated forms of deprivation of liberty and psychological control, where dignity and autonomy are violated silently, but with deep and lasting harm. However, when the legal process concluded, the impact of the case did not end with the pronounced sentence, but continued to permeate Margaret Ellis's everyday life as an irreversible reality, where survival does not equate to full recovery. Margaret's current physical condition clearly reflects the accumulated injuries from the prolonged confinement, with post-trial medical evaluations documenting chronic malnutrition, leaving lasting effects on the cardiovascular and digestive systems, diffuse muscle atrophy, and reduced bone density, causing limited mobility, along with joint and ligament damage that makes even simple activities such as long walks or carrying light loads a challenge. Despite continuous medical intervention, Margaret's body shows the forced adaptation to prolonged conditions of minimal movement and light deprivation, making physical recovery slow and unable to return to her pre-disappearance state. In parallel with these physical limitations, her psychological state after reappearance reveals even deeper and more complex consequences, as Margaret faces complex post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested through prolonged anxiety episodes, sleep disturbances, avoidance reflexes in open environments, and difficulty making independent decisions. Psychological evaluations note that Margaret's sense of safety has been fundamentally shattered, causing even familiar spaces to potentially trigger stress responses, and the presence of elements reminiscent of her prior isolation can easily return her to a state of heightened alertness. The long-term recovery process is therefore not just a matter of medical treatment, but a comprehensive rebuilding journey, including extended physical therapy to improve motor function, in-depth psychological therapy to address trauma, and ongoing social support to help Margaret gradually reintegrate into normal life rhythms. Experts emphasize that this process is not linear, with periods of improvement alternating with symptom relapses, requiring patience and consistent support over many years. The impact on Margaret's family is no less profound, as loved ones had to completely readjust roles and expectations, shifting from the initial joy of reunion to the realization that the woman who returned is no longer the same person who disappeared. The family grapples with feelings of helplessness while witnessing Margaret's physical and psychological limitations, and must learn to provide support without unintentionally recreating feelings of control or dependency, a delicate challenge in the context of caring for a survivor of prolonged confinement. Family relationships are tested by the shift in roles, as Margaret needs support while also requiring space to reaffirm the autonomy that was stripped from her for years. The limits of recovery become an unavoidable reality, as expert assessments acknowledge that some injuries, particularly neurological changes and enduring psychological response patterns, may be permanent or only partially improvable. This does not deny the possibility of continuing to live or rebuild a life, but it sets clear boundaries on returning to a pre-trauma state, forcing Margaret and her family to redefine the concept of recovery in terms of adaptation and acceptance. The social reverberations of the case extend far beyond the individual, as the community confronts the reality that sophisticated forms of confinement and control can exist silently for years without detection. The case has sparked widespread discussions about personal safety, community responsibility, and how legal, medical, and social systems must coordinate to identify early signs of control and dependency before the consequences become irreversible. For many, Margaret's story serves as a painful reminder that survival does not always take the form of complete liberation, but sometimes marks only the beginning of a long journey, confronting unseen wounds. In the present, Margaret lives at a slower pace, surrounded by ongoing medical and psychological support, with the goal not to erase the past, but to find ways to coexist with it, without letting it define her entire being. The aftermath of the case is therefore measured, not only by the sentence imposed on the perpetrator, but also by the years of recovery, adaptation, and quiet struggle of the survivor, along with the lasting impact the story leaves on societal awareness of freedom, safety, and the limits of healing. Margaret Ellis's story raises very specific lessons for life in the United States today, particularly in a society that highly values personal freedom, while simultaneously harboring dangerous gaps in awareness and community connection. Margaret did not disappear because of extreme recklessness, but because of a very familiar behavior for modern Americans, going on a solo day hike, trusting the safety of natural spaces, and believing that brief encounters with strangers in familiar environments are harmless. It was precisely that trust that Matthew exploited, showing that personal freedom, when not accompanied by vigilance and social support systems, can become a deadly vulnerability. The first lesson is the importance of maintaining connection. Margaret's family reported her missing early, cooperated fully, and the preserved missing persons file ultimately helped identify her after 3 years. This underscores that sharing travel plans, daily routines, and maintaining regular contact is not a restriction of freedom, but a practical form of protection. The second lesson comes from the very nature of the crime. Matthew did not use overt violence, but psychological control, isolation, and survival dependency. This reflects a present danger in American society, where violence does not always take the form of physical assault, but can be sophisticated control within relationships, confined or isolated living spaces. Margaret's long-term physical and psychological injuries, after returning, demonstrate that surviving does not mean the end. Therefore, the final lesson is the necessity of long-term support systems, medical, psychological, and community, for survivors, rather than expecting them to quickly return to normal. This story reminds today's Americans that freedom only truly holds meaning when embedded in a network of responsibility, vigilance, and mutual care. If Margaret Ellis's story has made you reflect on freedom, safety, and the hidden corners rarely seen in modern life, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in other real and haunting cases. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next video, where every story is not just a case, but also a lesson about humanity and society.